For those of you joining, we'll start in about 60 seconds. A lot of people are logging in. Good morning to those of you in the United States. Good afternoon to Europe, and good evening to Asia. I'm David Goldman, Deputy Editor of Asia Times, aka Spengler, and I'd like to introduce our guest moderator for this webinar on the subject of my new book, You Will Be Assimilated, China's Plan to Sino-form the World. Brandon Weichert is the publisher of the Weichert Report, a highly respected geostrategic analyst in Washington. He's a contributing editor to Real Clear Politics and the American Spectator, and a consultant to the United States Armed Forces, lecturer in much demand, and a frequent contributor to major publications. So we're very grateful to Brandon for guest moderating this webinar, and the floor is his. So Brandon, thank you and welcome from Asia Times.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
But before you start, I need to plug your book, which we'll discuss in a future webinar. It's called Winning Space: How America Remains a Superpower. I highly recommend it, and we'll have a lot more to say about this in the near future.
Wonderful, thank you, and thank you for having me. And I really just want to kind of jump right in, because your book is, I think it's probably the most important book, certainly of the year. You touch upon many issues that I'm very passionate about, and I know many of your readers are passionate about. And you have this very interesting way of looking at it that I think is quite distinct from how many of my colleagues in Washington tend to look at the situation. The title is fantastic. You Will Be Assimilated, which of course is a throwback to the Star Trek Next Generation. But the subtitle is what really gets me, which is the China's plan to Sino-form the world. Sino-form, it kind of sounds therapeutic, a little scary though also. And I would love it if you could just maybe just explain for the audience, what you mean by Sino-form. Is it a classical strategy of dominance that we're used to seeing, like the Soviets had, or even the Axis powers in the Second World War had? Or is this something new? Is this something that we are not quite prepared for? David.
Brandon, my perspective is a lot more Forrest Gump than Henry Kissinger. Through a set of coincidences, I happen to be a partner at a Hong Kong-based Chinese-owned investment banking boutique. I got to know Huawei quite well. We were working with them on a couple of projects, and I actually introduced some senior people from Huawei to a couple of governments, particularly the government of Mexico, where Huawei, by the way, is currently building a 5G broadband network on the American border, not talked about a great deal. I'm partly responsible for that. And I got the idea of You Will Be Assimilated because I listened to the Huawei people pitch the Mexicans and say, you are a big economy. You have bad broadband. Let us come in. We will make you like China. You can be rich like China if you have broadband. And I thought, this really sounds like the Borg in Star Trek. And by Sino-forming, China thinks that their model is the model of the future. The Chinese will tell you, look at us. We increased per capita income by 9 times in the last 30 years for 1.4 billion people. We urbanized nearly 600 million people. Nobody's done this sort of thing. And we can take our model and apply it all over the world and make other people like China and export the Chinese model. And the leading edge of that is, of course, broadband, because broadband today is like the railroads in the 19th century. It's not simply a technology that has huge merits of its own, but it's the carrier for a vast number of other technologies, including e-commerce, e-finance, autonomous vehicles, smart cities, smart manufacturing, artificial intelligence-driven medical technology, what the Chinese call the fourth industrial revolution. So this idea of sino-forming is simply based on me sitting in the back of the room with my jaw dropped, listening to the Chinese pitch the rest of the world.
Well, and it reminds me a lot, actually. There's two things that the sino-forming reminds me of. Well, the first is that in my book, I talk about there's a guy named Samuel Slater, and he was kind of the father of America's factory system. He came over from Scotland as a young man. He had worked in the textile mills, which of course were legendary at the time. And he basically took what he learned from England's advanced textile mills and he implanted it in the newly formed United States. And as we know, inevitably, America was able to not only catch up with the British Empire, which was the dominant industrial power back then, we were able to ultimately leapfrog them. And when I was reading your book, I couldn't help but think that sort of this might be happening again, only where now we're playing the role of the British Empire to the upstart Chinese. And of course, in Britain, they refer to Samuel Slater as Slater the Traitor, because he's had such an impact. You know,
it was IP theft.
Yes, exactly. But I think it's important, and you make this clear in your book. I think it's important to understand that China may imitate American technology in the beginning, but they're quite able to sort of build that base they need and then innovate on their own and manage to basically not just keep up, but leapfrog us in some ways. You point out, and something that I've tracked for a while is sort of what China's doing in quantum computing. I mean, it's quite frightening when you look at their investments. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that and sort of where we've fallen behind in such a new critical domain like quantum.
Well, a lot of my friends, people like, for example, Senator Ted Cruz, for whom I campaigned in 2016, my respect, are saying China is the new Soviet Union. This is a new Cold War.
Right.
I think that is a grave error. The Chinese are trying to play the American hand, not the Russian hand, in the Cold War. They looked at how we crushed the Russians, and they came to the conclusion that it was state sponsorship of dual-use technologies combined with private commercialization that allowed the United States to produce both guns and butter, whereas the Soviet Union spent 20 or 25% GDP on the military and starved its population and left them discontented and was unable to propagate advances that its brilliant engineers invented. The United States created military technologies in Bell Labs, RCA Labs, GE Labs, and so forth with Defense Department funding, and smart entrepreneurs turned them into multi-billion-dollar industries. Favorite example would be the optical network, whence we get cable television. That started as a DARPA project at RCA Labs to illuminate battlefields at night. And poking around, RCA engineers, guided by my friend and occasional co-author, Dr. Henry Crissell, invented the semiconductor laser. And then they realized, gee, this can be used to transmit information over fiber optic cables. That created the fiber optic networks, revolutionized the economy. There are a dozen other examples like that. And in fact, every major component of what we call the digital age today comes from a DARPA project, including the GUI interface that allows you to use a mouse on a Mac and so forth. No exceptions. The Chinese are using an American-style approach. Lots of people say, gee, the Chinese aren't creative, they're not inventive, they just steal. Well, the British, as you point out, said that about us in the 19th century. When you're coming from behind, it's a lot cheaper to steal than to innovate. But they've crossed the line from stealing to innovating, where they're now creating more IP, or at least as much IP as the United States. And whether the Chinese as such are the most inventive people in the world is a moot question, because a company like Huawei with 200,000 employees has 50,000 foreign employees,
Yes.
and most of their basic R&D is in fact done in Europe with some of the best European scientists and engineers. So they are indeed innovating. And in fact, Huawei has been a highly innovative company all along, much more innovative, in fact, than a lot of its Western competition. The reason it's the dominant player is not simply because they got government subsidies, it's because they're exceptionally well managed.
Yes.
And as a challenger, they bet on innovations in order to break in and thus achieve a dominant position. They spend twice as much in R&D as their two biggest competitors combined.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting point. And I talk about this in my book too. It's sort of like the field of dreams mentality. If you build it, they will come. And it used to be that the United States, we used to build out the infrastructure needed to conduct high-tech R&D. We used to woo all of the world's top talent. We still do, but it seems like China, as you noted, has learned at our feet for many years, and they're now applying it with the lessons learned with great elan. And we look at this, whether we're talking about quantum computing or even biotech. A little background on my wife was studying genetics at Yale, and every week or so, her cohort were receiving these emails from Chinese companies in Shanghai and Guangzhou, Shenzhen, saying, hey, come over, just forget about what you're doing. Come over and do your research in China, build out a genetics lab, do biotech research here. Don't worry about it. We'll pay your student loans off. We'll give you a good deal. It seems like China, not only are they really starting to innovate, but the reason they're starting to innovate is because they're knocking or pulling our people, pulling our investors away from America and into China today. And over the long term, it sounds like this could be a big problem. You mentioned in your book the concept of control points that I think was Paul Scanlon brought up to you from Huawei. And when I heard that, I thought, wow, this is classic geopolitics. What is he going to talk about? Maybe you could explain a little bit more detail about the concept of the control point in relation to the modern day.
Well, when we think about a control point, a great example for the 20th century would be oil. Right. Everything ran on oil, hydrocarbon-based economy. So the United States made a massive commitment to the Middle East, as did the British before them, because of the dependency on oil. Hitler veered his army away from Moscow and sent it to the Caucasus because he was concerned about taking over Russian oil production. The British fought Rommel in Africa for control of the Suez Canal, which was the lifeline of the British Empire for oil. The oil of the 21st century is data. Data is the resource on which the fourth industrial revolution runs, because data is the fuel of artificial intelligence. Computing power is the engine, but data is the fuel. Artificial intelligence is inherently stupid. Computers are dumb. So in order to do their job, they need massive data sets. So, for example, the Chinese facial recognition systems, which are a staple of their authoritarian surveillance state, are more than 95% accurate for Asian faces, but they're much less accurate for Western faces. And the reason is Chinese cameras do not capture nearly as many Western faces. Right. So when you talk about, for example, let's take medical technology, medical AI, maybe the biggest industry of the 21st century, aging population. US spends 20% of GDP on healthcare. The costs have to be brought down globally. Well, AI can do vast amounts. It can, if China has hundreds of millions of digitized health records, there's no privacy in China. Hundreds of millions of sequenced DNA. They have, since the pandemic occurred, real-time information on the vital signs of hundreds of millions of people who take their temperature with a Huawei smartphone or with an attachment. And that data is automatically uploaded into the cloud. There's an American company that does that, but it's got 200,000 users, so
Right.
relatively tiny. Once you've got a database like that, if you're a pharmaceutical company doing research on drug development and interactions, accelerate research by having that kind of data availability is spectacular. So every European pharmaceutical company now has a JV with a Chinese company because that's where the data is. Why is TikTok so important? Well, if you've got 2 billion installed